Hello everyone and welcome to the latest edition of the Football Culture Podcast. This episode is our first one we're doing on what I regard as a really important part of football culture, and that is books. And I have with me today a guest who has written a book on Spanish football. Today I'm joined by Miguel Lorenço Pereira, who wrote a great book on Portuguese football called Bring Me That Horizon, which I've read and I highly recommend. And he's joining me today to speak about his new book, which is called Pasión, which is about Spanish football. So, Miguel, how are you doing? And introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, James. First of all, thank you for having me. And then, well, you already said it. We have a book now out about Spanish football. I'm a sports journalist and football writer for like 15 years now. I've published books both in Portuguese, in Portugal and in Brazil, in Spanish, and now in English. My first book in English, like you mentioned before, was a take on the identity of Portuguese football, which was a subject nobody ever touched it before. And I think it was time to bring a little bit of more perspective on the impact that Portuguese football has had over the world, especially on this century, but throwing back with stories from the past as well. And while writing the book, I said, why not do the same with Spanish football? Because I lived in Spain for 16 years in Madrid. So I have a deep knowledge about both Spanish football and also Spanish society, a perspective from the outside, from not being born there, but at the same time, after living so long, also a perspective from within. So I thought it was good to tell that story. But I also wrote about the history of the Euros, the history about the European Cup. So I just love to dwindle in the history of the game, and also to see the game as a window to the society that we had in the past, that we are prepared to have in the future. Because I think football is probably the greatest phenomenon that explains the different shapes and natures of Europe, also other continents, but particularly in Europe, because it started here in a sense and it developed it here first. And Spain is a perfect example of how football helps to understand the complexity of a nation that is a nation of nations, as I used to say, a place where people speak different languages, but at the same time they fight against each other because of that and because of all the political subjects around those things. And football always represented a dimension of that fight, of that struggle. So I think Pasión is a good opening to that reality, to dwindle more on what Spanish football is all about, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, football is so important to Spanish culture, and a lot of the clubs are the representative of regions or cities and their local identities. So yeah, it's a if you ever live in Spain like I do, then you realise just how big it is here. It's everywhere in life. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the book then, the style, because this isn't really like just a history of Spanish football starting at the beginning and coming through to the modern day. How did you approach the style of writing the book?
Well, for the ones who already read, like yourself, Bring Me That Horizon, the style is very similar in the sense that this is basically a road trip. I travel a lot around the country, watching football matches, talking to people from different regions, different realities. So the take on the book is more like a journey around Spain, but it's also a journey that is not only geographically, but also a time travel journey. So basically, we mix both visiting different regions, knowing different realities, knowing the football clubs from within now, but at the same time having a perspective on what they were in the past, what their impact in their local communities, the also impacts of certain trades in the game, like how important is the Spanish press to the Spanish football identity, how important are the holding midfielders in how Spain is now perceived as a superpower within international football, how well evolved the national side throughout the years with different ways of seeing the game, how Spanish managers have become the flavor of the month over the past, let's say, 10 to 15 years, and what happened now and didn't happen before, so that could happen. And we have the Guardiolas, but also the Artetas and Luis Enriquez, and then the Emerys having so much success outside of Spain. So essentially, the book is a mix of everything around football Spanish, but in the same time, it's very dynamic in a way that one chapter is about the region, then we move to a more broader subject, and we go back to the journey on the road. So it makes it a very interesting way to get also different perspectives on Spanish culture, music, cinema, society, gastronomy, even tourist destinations eventually for ground hoppers who want to catch up a match and in spaces that they don't actually know or are not very talked about outside of Spain. So it mixes everything, and in a sense, the final conclusion is to make it football in Spain, we need all these ingredients. We need the past, we need the present, we need the different realities, the different languages, the different cities, the different clubs, the different tactical shapes that were developed within the nation, the different ways of seeing the match from the radio, from the Spanish press, from the books, from the movies that were made. So essentially, it's a sum of all that.
Yeah, and we'll touch on some of those different subjects today. So first of all, people are quite aware, for example, in the UK, the clubs are owned by usually owners, or groups or companies, because they're public limited companies. And in Germany, there's the 50+1 rule, where the majority of the club is owned by the members. Argentina is very similar; they're totally members-only clubs. Now, Spain is, in the present day, they operate a PLC system, most of the clubs, but that wasn't always the case, was it?
No, basically, Spain, like Portugal, had the same model there as the Germans. They were essentially club members who were running the show, were electing the board, were electing chairman through election. So essentially, for 7 to 8 decades of the game, Spanish footballs only had income regarding ticket sales, regarding player sales, and regarding the pay that the club members would have each month, the fee they would give the club to basically organize themselves. Obviously, that brought a problem that was the need to compete with nations from Europe who had PLC owners, like in Italy or in the UK, led most of the clubs to get in debt. And probably when we reached the end of the 1980s, almost every single club in Spain was hardly indebted. So the government decided to proclaim a law that obliged every single one of them, with the exception of 4 clubs, to become PLCs, because it was not sustainable to have the clubs on the verge of bankruptcy for all the debts they had to the social security. Even regarding taxes, they wanted to clear that debt out. So exception were made for Real Madrid and Barcelona because they were too big to be converted in PLCs, and too many votes there on the club members. So it was a broader group of people they didn't want to mess around with. But also with Athletic Club Bilbao and Osasuna, because they had a very important role in the Basque Country day-to-day life, and those were the days of ETA killing people, so they didn't want to upset them as well. But for all the other football clubs who played professionally, they were obliged to convert in PLCs. That in the first didn't bring up much issues, because most of the clubs decided to bought the majority of themselves. So essentially the club was still run by the socios. But as time went by, as football evolved during the 90s to a more commercialized version of itself, with the Bosman ruling, with the TV rights coming in, essentially most of the clubs ended up in hands of people that weren't elected by the club members, and the owners started to appear. There were some success cases, but most of them went particularly bad, taking between 10, 15 sides who played professionally in the league between the 1990s, early 2000s, directly to bankruptcy. Most of them were extinct and were later refounded by club members once again. And that's one of the great survival stories of Spanish football. You have examples of clubs that almost went dead but didn't, like Real Oviedo, for instance, who were on the verge of disappearing twice in the space of 10 years. But they are still there, and they are still working as the original club. But then you had the cases of clubs like Salamanca or Logroñés, or even clubs from Extremadura, who simply disappeared altogether. And that made the former club members to decide to take action and to begin their own Phoenix clubs, inspired by examples like AFC Wimbledon or FC United Manchester, who already started to do that in the UK in the mid 2000s. So essentially those clubs started from scratch, basically, again with the supporters exclusive from the club members, and now starting to climb up the football pyramid. And that makes them very interesting cases, because they don't have club owners. They are managed as a cooperative between all the club members, like it used to be 30 years ago for every single one of them. And they are growing up slowly, steadily, but they are growing up, and the phenomena has expanded. We now have around 20 football clubs in Spain that are now controlled by club owners outside of the professional leagues, outside the top 2 tier. That is the only ones that are recognized as being fully professional. We know that the first ref and the second ref are semi-professional leagues according to the Royal Spanish Federation. And we have the possibility of, in a couple of seasons, to see one of those sides climbing up to the professional leagues, because what made it mandatory to be PLCs back in the day is no longer available. The government of Pedro Sanchez has revoked that law. So now we can have club members again playing professionally on the top two, which is a very interesting story if it happens. I think it will happen eventually someday. And it proves that if club members do want, they can create sustainable projects. When we still have examples of clubs from big cities who are being poorly run over the years, they are changing owners and not getting the results, and at the same time getting even more distant from the local community. We have the example of Zaragoza, we have the example even of Valencia in the first division. So these club members who want to create that imprint, that recover a little bit of the lost soul of Spanish football with that change of the law, are transforming those sides like Unionistas, like SCD Logroñés, in banners of a new way to understand football. You got that tag, that famous tag against modern football is always very popular in these cases. But what they are really doing is trying to shape a new way of looking to football, especially at a time when we are moving fast forward to a Super League, an economic Super League eventually, then probably an official Super League as well. So if people want to be close with the community and enjoy the football club, this model has appeared to be a success case and probably will inspire more football clubs to turn back to their origins and return to be owned by club members, because it's a good way to enjoy how the game is 24/7.
Yeah, I mean, the last episode we was on FC United of Manchester, which is obviously a fan-owned club. But yeah, it's interesting. In the UK, the narrative has always been like all these clubs are in debt. You know, it can't continue. Fan ownership is the way forward. But it's interesting that in Spain there was member ownership, fan ownership, and you know, that was causing a problem as well. So it does open up that debate as to what the best model is. I mean, I think, in my opinion, I think the Germans have kind of got it right. It would appear, but you know, we will see. But I'm definitely for fan ownership myself.
I think it depends of what you want from your football club. One of the things that I learned traveling around and talking with the people in these fan-owned clubs is that we don't want to play Champions League. We don't want to go to Europe. That's not our goal. We want to have a club for the community to enjoy. We want to have a free debt club. We want to have a club for the youth academy. We want to have a club that represents the city or the region. So that's our goal. And if that is the goal of those football clubs, then it's sustainable as a model. Of course, that if you want to compete in the Champions League, if you want to have a budget of 100 million euros a year, you cannot be a club member owned, because you will never have enough members to sustain such a project, and you have to sell your soul eventually some way during the process. So if you are a club with ambitions to win Champions League, to become Real Madrid, to become Atletico Madrid, to become Barcelona, then you need a very powerful fan base like Madrid and Barcelona have, even eventually Atletico, but you also need a lot of money that cannot come exclusively from club members. But if you want to create community, if you want to use football to do more than just win games, then this is a very sane model to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most fans just want to have a club to support, and you know, it's such an important part of people's lives and the community aspect of it. Okay, so football in Spain, you mentioned in the book how football is consumed in Spain. So the football culture here is different from some other countries. So there's daily football papers. I mean, there's sports papers, but I mean, if you ever pick up a copy of Marco or Asset Sport or any of them, you know, it's there's a little bit of moto at the end, or basketball, but it's predominantly football. And you know, there's the bar culture in Spain as well. So obviously, you know, fans like to watch on TV. The bars are always busy for matches. Tell the listeners a bit about what you discovered about about how football is consumed by people here.
Well, there are two things that make it extremely different to what happens in the Northern Europe countries, especially in the UK. First of all, is that certain Europeans are different. So the way they live life, every aspect of life is different. It's very passionate. That's why also the title of the book. And you live in Spain for quite a long time to know that for experience. So of course, the way they would consume the game would be more intense, more pressing to every single detail. They don't see the game as just a game. They see a game as part of their lives. They see the clubs as part of their identity, as individuals, as families, as a group of friends. So that spirit also has to be reflected somehow in the press. And at the same time, we cannot forget that Spain was ruled by a dictator for almost 4 decades, with an iron fist, with censorship controlling everything that was written, everything that was said. everything that was thought. So eventually that left a profound imprint on what Spanish football is, and how Spanish football was culturally evolving through times. So essentially, that's one of the main reasons why there's a lack of football culture in movies and TV series, even in literature. It's a phenomenon that started very recently, because during the fascist years, they didn't want a book who would have people think about the impact that the game could have on their lives. They wanted people to be just entertained by the spectacle, or eventually by the swashbuckling world of the referee decisions, of the transfer market, but they didn't want to have any kind of philosophical stance on the game. And at the same time, even if football in Spain, like in many other countries, was a working class game throughout the decades, a fascist government don't want to propel the idea that the game as popular as football was something that belonged to the working class, because for them working class didn't exist as a concept. So that was also removed from the equation. So essentially, it took a long time for football to watch himself in the mirror and see himself like a cultural product, like movies, like music, like television, like any kind of art. And we have a reverse that over the past, I would say, 10 to 20 years. We have more publishers dedicating time to football books, whether it's football books about tactics, about traveling, about the nature of the football clubs, about individuals. We have two magazines in Spain, but only one of them is monthly, that is Panenka. We have Libro, which is quarterly. Back in the day, we had Don Balon, which is also monthly. But essentially, Spain has lived with the Spanish press, with the written Spanish press on a daily basis. And we have the Spanish newspapers, the Spanish sports newspapers, who are read more even than the generalistic newspapers, the more political societal newspapers, which is a reflection of how much want people to consume the game. And essentially, it is a way that was shaped by radio. I think more even than television. Television just copied the radio model and adapted to their media. But essentially, the world of radio was key to create a way that how Spanish lived the game. All those psychosis around referees, all of that intense debates about managers, about players in and out of form, about transfer, about even chairman's going to be elected or not, uh, even about the identities of the football clubs, and especially talking about Real Madrid, Barcelona, eventually Atletico Madrid, because a consequence of that is also that 80% of football clubs in Spain are almost never mentioned in radio or in the Spanish press. They are reduced to side notes in the end of the page. So essentially, that culture of the radio shows that last well into the night created a school of thought, a school of how the game is lived, that has survived throughout the time. And Spain remains probably the nation where radio still is super important to define how the football game is seen, is heard, and is thought of. And there is an evolution now. People are entering the arena coming from the internet for the newer generations. They are getting their space around YouTube channels, podcasts, or radio shows. But essentially, I think we're still living in a time where radio and the heritage of the Franquist years still shape in a way how they perceive the game and how their intensity as football fans is reflected on that daily basis consuming of information, even if the information most of the times is completely irrelevant. But they have to fill the pages, they have to put the news out, so they give relevance to things that quite don't have any kind of importance, but in the sense that it's a machine that never stops. And the same way football supporters in Spain never stop loving their football clubs 24/7. They don't just go there on the weekends to see the match. They are thinking the following match when the last one has finished already, and they are discussing it at work with mates. They are discussing in the family. So if essentially the press and the culture reflects that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember yesterday I was watching on Gold TV, Mbappe's sending off. There was like a debate for about over 40 minutes about his sending off, and I was kind of like, it was a bad challenge, it was late, it wasn't malicious, it was a red card, and that's the end of it. Because it's Mbappe and it's Real Madrid, they have to talk about it over and over again. And the radio aspect's interesting as well. Like, you ever jump in a taxi in Seville, where I live, the taxi driver always has the football commentary on. Always, if there's football on. I mean, if there isn't any football, obviously not. And then here, there's a radio station called Radio Betis. And it's a mixture of talking about Betis. They'll have the occasional song, but a lot of songs by local bands that have written songs about their love of Betis, or old flamenco songs about Betis. And then obviously commentaries, you know, when matches are on and stuff. The radio is like super important here. It's something you do realise. And also the TV as well, you know, like I'm sure a lot of listeners have seen clips from El Chiringuito on social media, which is a little bit of a joke, but people don't really watch it for seriousness. It's kind of watched to be enjoyed as a bit of entertainment. But it is interesting. And also touching on the point you made about the dictatorship as well, is that there isn't really a away fan culture here in Spain, is there? You don't often see away sections full of away fans. And I'm always asked this by people, because you go to Germany, there's lots of away fans. You know, is it a Southern European thing? Well, in Italy, they do have quite big away followings. So, you know, that's in Southern Europe. Why is it in Spain that do you think that fans don't travel so much? Now, I've got a few theories, but I'd be interested to see what you think.
I think that the first and principal consequence is poverty. Spain was a very poor country until the 1980s, so it was really expensive to travel around the country. And also, Spain is one of the biggest countries in Europe. People usually don't see it that way, but if you're living in Seville and you have to go to Barcelona to see a match, now you can catch a flight, 15-minute flight essentially. But back in the day, you had to pick up a bus, and you take more than a day to cross all the roads that would take you between Seville and Barcelona, or between Seville and Salamanca, or between Bilbao and Madrid. So we are talking about 6, 7, 8 hours long journeys. And for instance, in Germany, even in the UK, you have brilliant train lines that get you almost anywhere. So everything is well connected by train. So you just pop in the train and then you move around. In Spain, until the 1990s, there were almost no trains lines that connected the nation from point to point. You have obviously Madrid as a central hub. You had the train connection between Madrid and Barcelona and Zaragoza in the middle, and you had Madrid with Seville. But most of the country was not connected by train. So people had to pick up buses, had to pick up their own cars. Until the 1980s, poverty made very few people be available to buy their own cars. So essentially, it was a very hard task to follow your team around, because usually if you're playing in the National League, and even back in the day, now we have National League in Spain that almost reduced to 4 or 5 different regions. You have 4 or 5 clubs in Madrid. You have 2 or 3 clubs in Catalonia and Barcelona and Girona. Then you have 3 or 4 clubs around Valencia and that area as well. You have 3 or 4 clubs in the Basque Country. Eventually, some clubs from Mallorca, from the islands of Canarias. Eventually, some clubs from Galicia as well. But that made everything much more closer. So, and now with more train lines, with more money for people to spend in entertainment, with more flights that take you almost from anywhere in any part of Spain through the airline companies, it's easier now to follow the football club that you support. And I think the away days movement has changed over the past 10 to 15 years. And now you see more people moving around. But back in the day, it was extremely hard technically. And at the same time, you need to have a lot of money. But there were exceptions. Betis, for instance, was famous of the famous Green Marchers, who were a group of football supporters that travel around supporting the club when they were down in the 3rd division, because they spent 7 to 8 years in the 3rd division back in the 1950s. But of course, when they played in the 3rd division, they played in the 3rd division South, which means that basically people were moving around in Andalusia. So they were moving around Seville. So you got a lot of people following Betis. But at the same time, they were not going to Barcelona. They were not going to the northern shores of the Cantabric. They were moving around in their own area. So that was one of the reasons, for instance, that until the 1980s, there was division between North and South in the 2nd tier as well, because it was more easier even for football clubs to pay their expenses when they had to move around the country to play. If you were from Barcelona, then you had to go to Cadiz and you had to go by bus. The team would have to get a bus trip for like 13 hours straight, then stay a night at Cadiz, then play the game, then come back. So it was very hard, logistically speaking and economically speaking, both for football clubs and also for football supporters, to move around the country. So that changed when Spain entered the EU in the mid-1980s, with all the redevelopment of infrastructures, of highways, of train lines, with the airlines low cost in the 2000s. And I think now it's easy to see any football match any given weekend, with a lot of support from people that come from the away side. And probably that's a shift that will create in time a more fandom for away days. but it's still a recent reality.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it will take time for that to build because there's no history of
Yeah,
it. And talk
yeah,
about the infrastructure is improving, but like just little things like you can't get a train between Madrid and Lisbon, which is two
mm.
countries right next to each other.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
two
yeah.
capitals of two countries, you would have thought they'd be connected, but of course, Portugal as well has not been a wealthy country in the past. So, but with EU
Even in
money, maybe
Spain, if you're in Seville and you want to go to Malaga, for instance, which is the second biggest city in Andalusia, it takes forever if you go
yeah,
by train because there's no direct line. So that happens even with other regions of Spain. So imagine back in the day where there were no train at all. If people wanted to go from Seville to Malaga, which in the map looks extremely close, but in the end, because of the mountains and all the roads built around it, takes like forever. So that reflects a little bit of that away day culture in comparison with Northern Europe, where countries are smaller, are more tight, and we're all always much more better connected because obviously the Industrial Revolution arrived there 100 years before, so that they had time to create all the needed infrastructure to football to be followed by many throughout the 20th century.
yeah. And the infrastructure is improving, but slowly, poco a poco, as they say here. Okay, so now Spain has produced a lot of successful coaches. I mean, at the moment we've got Guardiola, we've got Emery, Champions League, Aston Villa playing tonight. Spain is exporting a lot of managers. Why do you think Spain these days in the modern era produce so many great coaches?
Well, I think there's a joint reason for it. First is the winning culture. If you are a big club from the Premier League or the Bundesliga or even Italy, you want to buy winners. You want to buy, even if there are managers or if there are players, you want to buy a guarantee to success. And when Spanish coaches started to win and to win big in Europe, with the beginning of the 2000s, with Vicente Del Bosque winning Champions Leagues, with Rafa Benitez winning the UEFA Cup and then Champions League, then Guardiola came with that super Barcelona side that everybody loved. Then you create a sort of winning mentality around the idea of the Spanish manager, the same way that happened to Portugal when Jose Mourinho came in. So essentially, we have untapped market. Then suddenly appears that people are very good at the job, so eventually you want to hire them. And if they work out, then people want to just imitate what you're doing, and eventually that creates a trend. And I think that's what happened with Spanish managers. And at the same time, there was obviously a change in mentality because if you go until the early 2000s, probably the greatest manager that Spain ever had only spoke Spanish. That's a cultural issue within the nation. Spanish is more spoken in the world than English. People usually don't realize that, but as a first language, there are more countries that speak Spanish than English. So for Spanish people to learn different languages has always been a huge task, even today. So essentially, they dub everything regarding television, cinema. They are not used to listen to different languages. So eventually they focus on their own. What's that meant is back in the day, even if you had talented or willing football managers that wanted to grow outside, they weren't able to express themselves. They weren't able to transform the knowledge that they had into realities outside of the Spanish world. That's why managers like Lilo, who is now the assistant manager of Guardiola and was the guy that practically invented the 4-2-3-1, never had a job outside of Spain or outside Spanish speaking countries because he's very famous in South America, but he can never have a coaching job in the UK or in Italy or in Germany because he wouldn't be able to pass on the message. And a lot of football managers suffer from that. They were talented, they were good, but they were never able to left an imprint. And come the 2000s, a generation of former football players who already started to learn English at school, who already started to have a more close relationship with colleagues from different countries, because until the 90s, of course, with all the limitations in the transfer market, you can only bring two foreigners, and sometimes Spanish club, the foreigners they would bring would be Argentinians or Uruguayans, so players were also Spanish speaking. So only in the 2000s they started to have a direct connection with different realities, and they started to be forced to learn English. And when they became managers, they eventually had already that skill set available to them. That's the case of Arteta, that's the case of Xabi Alonso, that's the case of Iraola, that's the case of Luis Enrique, even Guardiola. There are managers who were forced to learn English as players and now can work as managers, knowing English and knowing different languages as managers. And the generation before them couldn't. So you had everybody remembers how people were picking up on Unai Emery when he arrived at Arsenal. with his good morning, like he was a TV show comedy character. And essentially, in Emery is a very young guy. Is a guy that already grew up learning English more than his antecessors. So basically, if you think that Emery speaks bad English, then you had to listen to Vicente del Bosque or to Javier Clemente or to all the other guys that came before him who were very good at their jobs but couldn't speak a word of the language. So essentially, learning the different languages and also be part of a generation that was winning things made the open doors for the rest of the world to get to know more about the Spanish training. And also the same thing is, if you look to managerial history around the world, you usually have tactical trends. If you search for a Dutch manager, you know that you're going to find a manager that wants to play like a 4-3-3 or has ideals close to total football. If you go to Germany, then you had the local imprint. If you go to Italy, you expect to have a manager that will be great on catenaccio. Of course, we are speaking broadly here, but those countries had an identity. Spain never had an identity of their own. They were a nation that usually adapts more to the quality of the players than to the idea of the tactics, because it was also a league that was rich in quality players, in star players. They always focus more on the player than on the manager. So for a lot of the times, manager was seen like sidecasts within a project. And if you look at clubs like Real Madrid, they still are. These are football clubs that belong to players, not to managers. Barcelona changed that when Cruyff arrived, because until that, Barcelona was just like Real Madrid. They hired Maradona, they hired Cruyff back in the day, they hired Kubala. They usually go for the best players, and because they believe the best players had the best way to win things. And when Cruyff arrived as a manager, he was the first one to define a blueprint on how to play, inspired at the one that he had lived at Amsterdam, which was a following up of the old Danubian school mentality of play that came from Scottish footballers back in the early century. So he followed a trend that already existed, but he was the first guy in Barcelona to do that. That's why the Barcelona that we know today, and when we speak about, the Barcelona school, actually comes from Cruyff. It only has like 30 to 40 years old, in a football club that lived for 126 years. So essentially, Spanish football, being a nation of footballers, never a nation of managers, took time to appreciate their own managers, and then the world took time to appreciate them as well. But I think now they're on a higher up, and there's a lot of managers in Spain already that will probably be linked to jobs in the bigger leagues in the future, because they have the knowledge to speak out their ideas and the ability to win, which is the most important thing in football.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the past, I mean, younger listeners might not realise, but Spain played, what the Spanish national team played, in a lot more physical fashion than they do these days. I mean, I watched for an article I was writing, Real Betis Athletic Club Bilbao, 1977 Copa del Rey final. There's lots of long balls, there's lots of tackles, there's no tiki-taka going on there at all.
No.
It's a very, very different game. So, I mean, how important was Cruyff? Because I guess it starts with Cruyff, the change in the Spanish playing style. How important was Cruyff to that?
Oh, he was massive. I think he came at the right time, because, like I said before, Spain was being ruled by Franco's dictatorship for 40 years. He died in the late 70s. Then we had a period called Transición, which was a period when slowly, very slowly, Spain moved from a dictatorship to a full democracy. It took their time. There was no revolution. There was no popular revolt. It was very much more slow process that already in the 1980s, mid 1980s, you could start to feel that it had worked out finally. And at the same time, a brilliant generation of Real Madrid players called the Quinta del Buitre started to win a lot of titles. They won 5 in a row. They became European royalty. So the mix of that Real Madrid side with Cruyff coming at the right time, because Spain was more open to new ideas. People were now embracing a full democracy regime. They were fully embracing the need for dialogue, the need for connecting with different ideas from abroad. That in itself created the perfect context for his ideas to thrive. And then both the flair of the football players that they already had, with the tactical imprint of Cruyff, or people who wanted to be like Cruyff, were inspired by Cruyff at the same time from different ideas from abroad, like Arrigo Sacchi's Milan, which happened with managers of, like I said before, Lillo, but also Rafa Benitez, also managers who left a profound imprint on Spanish football, helped to create a new idea how the game should be played. And probably until the very late 90s, the game would still be played like they always had been, like you said before, very direct football, very physical football, an approach that was more close to the UK way of play, of not necessarily kick and rush because players were very talented, but at the same time they look for fighting spirit, and they look for aggressiveness in much of those footballers. But then in the 2000s, the ideas of Cruyff already been there for like 10 to 15 years. So the seeds had been planted. Spanish sides were beginning to win things in Europe. Real Madrid winning Champions League all over again after a 30-year hiatus. Barcelona with Rijkaard also winning the Champions League. So at the same time, I think the right ideas came with the right people. So they left the basis for what became the golden era Spanish football, both with the international side winning back-to-back Euros and a World Cup, but also with Barcelona of Guardiola becoming probably one of the greatest teams in the world, but also Real Madrid of Mourinho, and then of Zidane and Ancelotti winning a lot of titles, but also the Seville side who won 7 Europa Leagues. Also, the Atletico Madrid of Diego Simeone, who was winning 2 leagues and competing in Champions League finals. So all those different stories started to spring out after that period of transition, of democratic transition, and the ideas that Cruyff left behind, who opened Spain to new ideas on how the game should be thought, should be played, and should be watched.
Yeah, absolutely. There's different styles. I mean, Simeone's style very different from Guardiola's style,
Yeah.
but some people have the stereotype that Spanish football is all just tiki taka, as they say, but it's not quite the case. The teams play in different ways. Okay, so one thing that does really come through in the book is the focus on the different regions of the country, and I mean that's vital to understand in Spain. That it's a collection of different regions that all have their own culture and their own identities. So let's touch on a little bit about each of the main regions. So I think we'll start with Andalusia because that's where the game started in Spain, where I'm speaking from now here at Seville. With Recarevo del Jaobo were the first club, and then Sevilla Football Club were recognised as the second. Although there's a bit of controversy about that, but I'm sure listeners can read about that in the book. So tell us a little bit about football in Andalusia and the clubs in the region.
Well, I think if we talk about Spain, I usually say that is a nation of nations. So essentially, more than regions, you have really nations within the same country. People are more, if they are more left wing, they are open to that idea. If they're more right wing, they're not. But essentially, that almost the truth because you have different languages, you have different cultural aspects. And Andalusia, if you look at it, it's the reflection of Spain as a unit. It's probably the region more Spanish if you think Spain outside of Spain. And that's probably because it was a creation of Franco as well, because Franco wanted that the image of Andalusia to be spread out throughout the nation, to cancel all the different nationalities that exist more in the northern areas of Galicia, the Basque Country, Catalonia, eventually even Valencia. So when people look at Andalusia, they think of Spain lost in time. It's like a sense of a Spain of before today. And football, I think, represents that as well, because football in Andalusia is very different to how the football is played north. They look more for artistry in most football clubs. They look for players that are able to entertain. They look at football as a mix of bullfighters and also at flamenco singers, because they need to have the grit, but at the same time they need to have the ability to perform and to win the masses. So it's very odd that such a bigger region only has 2 league winners, and both of them back in the old days, and they were never able actually to compete for a league title except for one season with Seville in 2007, I would say. So essentially, it's very odd that such a rich region never was able to create successful projects. And I think that has to do also with the local mentality, the passionate way they live the game, were never enough for them to create sustainable, logical projects behind the big clubs. And also because outside of Seville, you probably have Cadiz, which has a local fan base that is absolutely bonkers and huge. But then all the other cities of Andalusia struggle to have a very strong local identity transfer to football. You have a lot of people in Andalusia who are followers of Barcelona, Real Madrid, even in places like Granada or Cordoba, who are big cities, important cities in the history of Spain, Jaén, Almeria. And Malaga is a strange case because Malaga had all the ingredients to have that sort of project. And when they were bought by Altani back in 2009, it seemed that they would go that way when they built that super team, probably the best squad that Andalusia ever had. A lot of top players playing the Champions League quarterfinals against Dortmund. And they have all the ingredients to have a winning project there. But then again, with the financial fair play ruling and the decision of Altani to just forget about the project 2 years after he took off, uh, left a deep scar within the Malaga community. And probably, I think if Andalusia wants to rise up, they really need that both the two Sevilla clubs and also Malaga to be winning projects, to create a mix of the local identity, but also with an eye to the future, an eye to how to be competitive within the game. But in the same sense, like I said before, it's always very different for a region that is so passionate to everything they do in everything of their daily life, to expect some rationalism regarding football, which is one of the most bonkers universes that you can enjoy in Andalusia. So also the failing of those projects also a reflection of how Andalusia is as a society, in a sense.
Yeah, it's certainly a passionate place. I mean, in Seville, everyone supports Betis or Sevilla, more or less. You know, you don't really see Real Madrid or Barcelona unless they're from, you know, elsewhere. And Cadiz as well. If you go down to Cadiz, I thoroughly recommend a trip to Cadiz if you ever get a chance. Great city and a great little club as well. And you will, all over the region of Cadiz, see a lot of Cadiz shirts. But yeah, if you go to Cordoba and then other parts of Andalusia, it becomes more about Real Madrid and Barcelona. And Malaga's an interesting one as well, because there's, you know, you've got a lot of Brits and Germans living there that support the local club as well. You know, and it's quite a big city, so there is potential there with Malaga. But of course, they're coming back from having fallen down. Okay, so at the other end of the country, if Andalusia is very much like the traditional idea of Spain, and, you know, Franco liked the fact that Andalusians are very proud to be Andalusian, but they've got no issue with being Spanish either. So a region that's quite different from that is Catalonia. And of course, everyone will know FC Barcelona, but there's other clubs there as well, aren't there?
Yeah, essentially Catalonia is a very strange region because obviously they people need to understand first that the idea is Spain as a country, as a united country, only exists after 1492. So we're basically talking about a nation that is less than 600 years old. And if you compare it with Portugal, that is 1,000 years old, or even England, which is much more older than that, it gives you a broad perspective that different nations were evolving at the same time with different identities. And Catalonia was never an independent nation of sorts, but they always have a sense of uniqueness of their own. So they were part of the Kingdom of Aragon for a lot of the time, but they also were connected with the French kingdom at some point in history. And they are a nation much more connected with the Mediterranean, with the commercial routes, with Italy, with Northern Africa. So their cultural and social imprint is very different if you go to Seville, or if you go to Madrid, or if you even go to Galicia on the other side of the peninsula. And they are very proud of their uniqueness. And Barcelona, since almost the beginning, despite having been founded by a foreigner, embrace that uniqueness, that specialness that Catalans believe they have within the nation of nations puzzle that is Spain. But they are not exclusive to that, because eventually you also have people that live in Catalonia that feel pretty much Spanish, and they do believe that Catalonia should be part of a bigger thing called Spain. So you have the Espanyol fans, which are a more complex club, because if you look at Barcelona, the historical followers of Barcelona are pretty much Catalanists. Now, since they started to win things, because Barcelona was not a winning football club until the 1990s, or at least it wasn't for a long time. Winning brought different supporters who probably don't care too much about politics or society. They just want to enjoy the best players and just to enjoy the wins. But if you look at a club as Espanyol, who almost haven't won anything for decades, you have a much more complex puzzle of who they are as a club. And most of them are followed by people who do live in Catalonia, who do believe that they are also Spanish. But they also have followers that are Catalans from Catalonia that believe Catalonia should be independent or have greater autonomy, but at the same time they feel represented for the club. And also you have a different phenomenon in Catalonia, because back in the 1960s, Franco's government had made life so hard for people in Andalusia, for people in Extremadura, for people in Castilla-La Mancha, who are the most poor regions in the south, that they were forced to migrate to the northern, more richer areas of Madrid, of the Basque Country, and of Catalonia. And that was part of a big plan that Franco had, because he believed that if he took people from Andalusia or from Extremadura who felt very much Spanish, they would then go to Catalonia, they would install themselves there, and they would dilute the nationalism that existed. So you also have a huge community of people who live there for like 2 or 3 generations, but they are not Catalans. They're not perceived as Catalans, not from the people that were already there, and eventually not even for themselves. And they're also like a third way to understand Catalonia, of the people that came from the outside, who live there, who has embraced some of the particularities of the region, but at the same time they remain profoundly Spanish, because they also remain Andalusian, they also remain from Extremadura, they also remain from Castilla, because they want to keep the heritage of their forefathers. And that's, for instance, the example of how Betis, who is from Seville, is also probably the third most supported club in Catalonia, because a lot of people from Sevilla went there. And every time that Betis goes to play against Barcelona, Espanyol, or Girona, they have a huge following up of people coming in, because they feel that this is their football club, despite being hundreds of kilometers away from where they live, because it represents their origins. So in a sense, it's a very complex region, and football is a good expression to understand that.
Yeah, it's like Hector Bellerin being a case in point, and also I think I read somewhere so in Spanish football they're Peñas, which are like supporters club, and the number one in Catalonia is actually Barcelona, as you'd expect. But number two is not Espanyol; it's actually Real Betis, which shows how many have gone up there for there to be that many clubs up there. And Espanyol's an interesting club. If you look at Espanyol's attendances in the past, they were a lot higher than they are these days, and I'm curious as to why they've lost, some supporters down the years. Maybe it's the success of FC Barcelona. I don't know. Okay, so Catalonia has got an independence movement. It's quietened down somewhat now. But in the past, it was a lot stronger, is the Basque Country. And obviously, Athletic Bilbao, or Athletic Club. Often, strictly speaking, they're called Athletic Club, but a lot of people say Bilbao just to confirm, where they're from. Have the Basque-only policy and a strong Basque identity. But there are other clubs that have a huge Basque identity as well, aren't there?
Yeah, essentially, the Basque Country, if Catalonia doesn't believe they are part of Spain, but somehow they try to be, or at least they try to see how they can fix in. I think the Basque never cared to be part of Spain at all. So they have a very autonomous regime for a long time now. And despite all the suffering that was there during the 1980s and 90s with the ETA killings, of course, they always been different to everything that is Spanish. And their language is very different. If Catalan is different from Castilian, but at the same time it has the same Latin roots. The Basque have nothing to do with anything Latin, so nobody knows where they came from actually, so nobody understands how they got there in the first place. And being surrounded by mountains all around have made them live like it's like they were in the Shire, really, if you like the Lord of the Rings metaphor. So essentially, they just live in small villages. There are no big cities in the Basque Country. The biggest cities are small in comparison with other regions. They are very local. They still enjoy pretty much of the local passpoint. They local sports, local music, local identities, events. So football has come to be a reflection of that as well, because there you really do find a fandom that is very extreme and very connected with the local club, whether it's Athletic Club, where it's Real Sociedad, but even smaller sides like Eibar or like Irún or like Arenas Getxo or like Deportivo Alavés. Even in the case of Navarre, with Osasuna, which is also considered to be part of the Basque Country, despite there now being a different region in the map of the regional administrative society in Spain that is currently present. So essentially, that sense of belonging to the local rooting side of the things has made Basque football very special. But at the same time, despite all that uniqueness, all Basque football is British in a sense, because it was basically the point of contact with the southern British ports, especially Portsmouth and Southampton, that took the game there. You see it on the football shirts, very similar to most of the football shirts where in Britain back in the day. The football stadiums are built in the same way of the old British ground, at least the old school football that's still standing. Some have been refurbished, like the Real Sociedad and the Athletic Club. But if you go to Vitoria or if you go to Eibar, you still see that sort of architecture that you are used to see in the football leagues in the UK. So even the way they live their fandom, the way they live their pub life, very connected, with very similar traits to what happens in the UK. So they are very unique, but at the same time, they're a very good reflection. They're probably the most UK-ish region in continental Europe regarding football fandom. So it's also a very interesting take to have on the region.
Yeah, and you can see the British influence in some of the past coaches. You know, you had Howard Kendall and John Toshak, yeah, up in the Basque Country. Yeah, and British coaches didn't come to Spain so much. I mean, you had Venables at Barcelona, and Bobby Robson as well. But yeah, it's interesting that connection, of course, with the ports. Okay, so the capital of Spain, kind of the place in the center with all of these independently minded regions, or if they're not independently minded, then certainly very different regions, is Madrid. And there's quite a few clubs in Madrid, isn't there?
Yeah, and also Madrid it's not only geographically in the center, but it was made to be so. It was a small village that was the capital city during the 16th century. So very recently, if you also looked at the history of what Spain is as a nation, and it was built there because the king Philip II, same guy that tried to invade the UK with his invincible armada, decided that Spain needed a capital, a fixed capital, because it was moving around different cities around the country. Sometimes it was in Seville, sometimes it was in Valladolid or in Segovia or in Toledo, different cities, Burgos, eventually Leon back in the day. So they wanted the city to be a reflection of the nation itself. And from day one, Madrid has a uniqueness that is the ability to open their arms to everybody. It's a city that is very heartwarming in the sense that very few people actually are from Madrid if you look back generations. So they usually have this trait, like it's only the if you are from the third generation of Madrid, where your fathers and your grandfathers and your great grandfathers are from Madrid, then you are one of the kind, because it's very likely eventually that parts of your family have come from other parts of Spain during that process of like 80 years. Because that reflected in football as well, because Atletico Madrid, for instance, was founded by Basques who were living in Madrid and went to see a match between Athletic Club and Real Madrid, and they were felt very enraged on how Real Madrid supporters attacked the Basque players, so they decided to create a Basque club in the city. And only like a couple of decades later, they become a club of their own. Rayo Vallecano, for instance, is a football club with a very strong local identity, because Vallecas was a point of where the people, like we talked before about Barcelona, but it happened the same in Madrid, where the poor people from Andalusia, from Extremadura, came to live in Madrid to find work. And eventually they would settle in Vallecas, which was like a mix of shanty towns around a small village that grew up to be a big city. And it was then practically engulfed by Madrid itself. So they develop a very strong identity of community. And you have also, of course, Real Madrid, which is more connected now in the mind of people as be a right-wing club, very connected with the local hierarchies of power. But essentially, it was a club that only started to win during the Republican years, a very left-wing approach back in the day. But then eventually got a very visionary guy as a chairman in Santiago Bernabeu, who decided one day that he wanted to build the biggest stadium in Spain with a side that was fighting for relegation. People usually don't remember that Madrid was about to drop to the second tier for a couple of times during the 1940s and early 50s. Then he was lucky enough to sign one of the best players in the world, in Alfredo Di Stefano. And at the same time, a European Cup came in that nobody was expecting to. And if you join the three ingredients together, then you have the Real Madrid that we all know. But that Real Madrid has 70 years old. The Real Madrid of before was a very different football club, a club also very connected with the working class people in Madrid. So you have all those different takes and stories. And at the same time, Madrid is becoming like London, a region that is ever more important in Spanish economy. The outskirts around the city are growing fast. Football clubs like Retafe or like Leganés also have become first division sides for a lot of the last 10 to 15 seasons, because they have the financial ability to compete even more than historical clubs from smaller cities from other parts of the nation. So I think eventually what we are looking at is that in a couple of 10 to 15 years, I would say, we will probably have 6 or 7 teams from Madrid in the first division, because there's a lot of money pouring in, smaller sides that now are competing on the third or in the fourth tier, that will probably have the ability to create winning projects that will take them to be competitive enough to play in the first division eventually. Sides I would say like San Sebastián de los Reyes or Alcalá de Henares or even Alcorcón, Fuenlabrada, who are almost as big as some provincial capitals are. And if they are as big as, and if they have the ability to attract investment, and they can use also the youth players from Madrid and Atletico Madrid that are left behind from their football clubs because they want to go only for the most absolute elite, then they eventually we can get the chance to see another Retafe coming in soon. And Retafe is a winning story if you look at Spanish football of the 21st century, because they were only founded in '84. They already played in the Europa League 3 or 4 times. They played 2 Copa del Rey finals. So probably it's a nice story to remember that Madrid is much more than Real and much more than Atletico.
Oh no, absolutely, yeah. I mean, Madrid for me is the friendliest capital city I think I've ever been to.
Yeah.
Lisbon's quite friendly as well, but like compared to like Berlin or like Rome or London, I was just very struck for a capital city how friendly everyone was. And yeah, there's lots of different clubs there, different identities like Real Madrid. The Real Madrid story is an interesting one. I think Di Stefano could well be the sliding doors moment in Spanish football. Him signing there. You've got Rayo Vallecano down in Vallecas, like this kind of the St. Pauli of Spain. And I've been to Vallecas, went to a match there, and someone said, "Oh, you want to be careful going to Vallecas, it's very dangerous." I didn't think it was dangerous at all. Everyone was very, very nice and very, very friendly to me. I think, and they have good humour as well. Like at the time, I didn't have hardly any Spanish, so I asked them if they spoke English, and they said back to me in Spanish, "You come to Vallecas and expect us to speak English, we can hardly speak Spanish," which I thought was like, it was set with a smile. So everyone was really nice there. And again, yeah, you've got Getafe and Leganés on the suburbs. So yeah, Leganés now in the Primera for now, but I think they've had investment from America as well. So might be something to watch around Madrid. Okay, so obviously to the north of Madrid, we've got Galicia and Asturias, so up in the northwest corner of the country. Tell us a bit about Galicia and Asturias, because everyone has this idea in their head of Spain of being beaches and sunshine and everything like this. Now, I've been to both Asturias and Galicia, and it is very different from that, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can add Cantabria to the lot as well, because it's practically the same build-up, the same geographic relationship between the mountains on the back, the beaches, but the beaches are not the Mediterranean beaches. It's the Atlantic. It's windy. It's chilly. Eventually, so you have a total different experience. Like I said before, Spain is a country that it is for you what you experience. If you are in Seville, then of course you experience the Spain that everybody knows about, the heat, and you experience the outdoor life. But if your experience is in the north, especially if you are in Galicia or in Asturias or in Cantabria, then your experience is much more like if you're in Scotland, really, or if you're in Wales or if you're in Ireland. And there is a lot of those local traditions as well, because Galicia, for instance, is a place where the Celtic tradition is still well alive, like in Ireland. And at the same time, they live the life of their own. They feel Spanish in a sense because Spain started in Asturias, at least the Spain that we know now, the Spain of the Reconquista movement, when they were invaded by Muslim armies back in the 8th century. And then they just started to win back the terrain. It took them like 6 or 7 centuries to do that. And all those processes started in the area of Asturias and in the area of Cantabria and Galicia, and then they moved south. So they feel very proud to be the origin of Spain, but at the same time, they feel very proud to be themselves. They are very different. They drink different types of beer, more cider. Even gastronomy is very different from the one around Madrid or Barcelona or Valencia or Seville. And the football stories are different as well. If you look to the Galician football stories, they are more connected with the darker side of the game, if you want to, regarding there's a presence of the narcos culture there because of the importance that drug trafficking had in Galicia economy during the 1980s and early 1990s. Then you have the connection with South America, because most of the immigrants that left Spain to live in Argentina and to live in Uruguay or in Chile or in South America came from those areas. Even they are known as Gallegos still today in South America, the Spanish people are. So essentially there has always been a bridge, a social and cultural bridge. That's why, for instance, if you look back at the day of the great Deportivo side of the 1990s, there were a lot of Brazilians there. There were a lot of South Americans there, because they was used to import that talent from the Americas. And at the same time, you also have a different type of fandom, because of course Real Madrid and Barcelona are popular in the areas like they are everywhere else in Spain, but people there really feel the club culture. And Oviedo, for instance, is a great example. Oviedo comes from the capital of Asturias, and it was a country that was about to be bankrupt in 2012, and local people just got together and were able to get the money with the help of people from most parts of the world, especially the UK, because at the same time, uh, three academy graduates of Oviedo were playing the Premier League in Santi Cazorla, in Juan Mata, in Michu. So eventually, with the help of Sidlo, which was the Guardian correspondent in Spain, and also with the help of another people connected with the players, they were able to get the money. But it was essentially a local movement that saved the club, and that connection has made, for instance, the derby of Asturias between Sporting Rijon and Real Oviedo, or the derby of Galicia between Celta Vigo and Deportivo, two very intense matches. And I always recommend to ground hopers, if they want to go to Spain and live a different experience from the traditional idea of Spain that you have, you just have to catch one of those matches, because you live something much more similar to what we will find, I don't know, in the Netherlands or in Germany or in the UK than you would expect to find in the rest of Spain.
Absolutely. I've not been to Real Oviedo yet, but me and some friends went to Sporting Gijon, and we'd gone to a lot of matches in Germany, and we were like, this feels really German, this atmosphere. Really noisy. I mean, it's one of the, I always say, it's one of the best atmospheres that I've experienced in Spain, was at Sporting Gijon. I mean, it may be the same at Oviedo, I don't know, I've not been. But yeah, it had that, and as well, it obviously has that Spanish vibe about it in Galicia, but it also, you've got, it's a lot greener, and there's a lot more rain. And there was a guy, we went to La Coruña, there was a guy playing bagpipes, in the city. It's like, are we in Scotland or are we in Spain here? So you can definitely feel that. I haven't visited Vigo yet, but that's on my ever expanding list of places that I need to get to. Okay, so one region we haven't covered as of yet, very important to Spanish football as well, is Valencia. Now, Valencia, everyone knows Valencia CF, but there's a few more clubs, not just Valencia in that area, is there?
Yeah, essentially the area called Levante, which covers basically everything between Andalusia and Catalonia within the Mediterranean coastline, is a very good reflection of what Spain is as a nation as well, and especially over the past 25 years, socially and politically, because Valencia is a region rich regarding culture. They always have been. They were key in introducing in Spain very different nuances of what the nation was used to when the tourism boom started in the 1960s. Even within Franco's dictatorship, it was the sliding door moment that opened Spain to the world, even when they were still being ruled by the dictator. The beaches around Valencia were key, because British and German and Dutch tourists started to flock into Spain with their customs, with their identity. So, for instance, women started to go topless or wearing bikinis on the beaches, and it was totally forbidden for Spanish women, who were deemed back in the day as property of their husbands. So it was a cultural shock that paved the way for the sexual revolution that Spain had in the late 70s. Even musical themes like the Manchester dance culture entered in Spain through Valencia, where they had the so-called Bacalao route or Destroyer route, where the most famous clubs in Europe, in continental Europe, were there around the city of Valencia, or on Ibiza, which in the Baleares, which is very close by to Valencia. So they were key points in Spain as a cultural nation that kickstarted there. And regarding football, it happened as well, because football clubs were practically being funded by the local government or local companies that at the same time were getting rich with property housing, then practically exploded with the bubble crisis in housing in 2008. And Valencia, the football club who played back-to-back Champions League finals, they are the only football club who lost back-to-back Champions League finals. They were very affected by that, and then they have been suffering from the consequences of that still today, being owned by a guy from Singapore who doesn't really care about the football club and has been almost mining the future of the football club throughout the days, but also had projects that worked out really well, like Villarreal, for instance, who sits like 50 kilometers north of Valencia, who is owned by a very famous entrepreneur from the area, who decided to create the perfect football club, in a sense that he wanted to create a debt-free club that used to play attacking, attractive football, very much based on the infrastructures that they would create for academy graduates. So Villarreal has become a case of success, and winning the Europa League final against Manchester United was like the culmination of that process. And at the same time, you have like 5 kilometers away, Castellón, which is also a provincial capital, who could have been Villarreal, because the owner of Villarreal now wanted to buy Castellón instead. He couldn't. He bought Villarreal. Then Castellón, which was a much more important side back in the day in the region, went into a spiral of downwards that ended up almost with the club disappearing, and now has been bought by a Canadian entrepreneur who worked in the NBA, which is a famous poker player, who had decided to apply Moneyball concepts to football, and also helped to raise the club from the ashes. And they were playing the third division. They're now playing the second division this season, and they are creating a project that wants to take Castellón to the first division. So we have seen the worst of football in Spain in Valencia, but we also saw some of the best. And at the same time, we also saw a region that reflected those cultural shifts that were important to define the progressive idea of nation that Spain has today, that during the fascist years couldn't develop as well as in cities like Madrid or Barcelona.
Yeah, I was really interested to read in the book actually about the music scene in Valencia, because I used to be a DJ in Manchester. Played on the Pasión. I DJ'd on the Hacienda's old sound system and stuff like that. So I was like, oh, I actually didn't know that about Valencia. That's something I really didn't know. So that was interesting. But yeah, and it's quite shocking as well that Valencia wasn't chosen as a host city for the World Cup that will be jointly held in Spain, which is surprising. There's obviously been some failures there for that not to happen, but that's another story. But yeah, if Valencia haven't been run very well in recent years, another football club that represents the region of Aragon is Real Zaragoza, who are struggling somewhat in the second division. I mean, people will know from the 90s. I remember watching them to beat Arsenal in the Winners' Cup final. They had a great side there. Tell us a bit about Zaragoza and Aragon. I mean, what's gone wrong there?
Yeah, I mean, Zaragoza is probably the biggest club in Spain that never won the league. So they have been big since the 1960s. Zaragoza is a very rich town in a sense that sits between Madrid and Barcelona. So they always have been a hub between both cities, and has developed economically quite well throughout the time. They also the historical capital of Aragon. Like I said before, it was the big kingdom in the eastern part of Spain, the same way Castile was the biggest kingdom in the west part, until they joined forces together in the late 16th century. So essentially, what we have in Zaragoza is the perfect case of how football clubs have been poorly run in Spain in the 1990s and 2000s. Because like you said before, they were a winning project back in the 1990s. They had in Victor Fernandez a very promising manager. They played and won that Winners' Cup final against Arsenal. They have beaten Chelsea in the semi-finals as well. So they had all the conditions to be a club able to fight for the league title, like Deportivo was during that time in Galicia, and they eventually succeeded, like Valencia was also at that time. But they were never able to give that extra step, because in a sense they were run by people who really didn't understand the game, or at least they didn't understand where the game was going. So Zaragoza was a club that splashed loads of money into buying players without a sound project behind. They buy players like David Villa or Pablo Aimar back in the day, or Diego Gabriel Milito, iconic players if you remember from the 2000s, but never able to give them the perfect context to thrive. And when they dropped to the second tier, for a long time, they behaved like they still were first division in the second division. And everyone that knows the second division or have been support a club that is in the second division, the first thing that you need to know is you're going to be in the mud. You're going to play with sides that really understand how to suffer, because they have been there for a long time. You cannot go there pretending like you're a big side, because you're getting your teeth knocked off. And Zaragoza has been getting all their teeth knocked off over the past 15 years, which is a shame, because it's probably one of the football cities with the richer culture in Spain. It's a club with a great history behind, a great stadium that now is going to be refurbished for the World Cup. So essentially, Spanish football really needs a good Zaragoza in the first division, but they are still unable to create that sound project in the second tier that gets them up to the first tier and then allows them to develop once they got more income from the TV rights or better sponsoring that they are not able to get from the second tier. So it's very odd, strange, but also a reflection of Spain as a nation, because Zaragoza, like many cities in the interior of Spain, is fading away in relevance, in economic relevance, and social relevance. So it's also a consequence that clubs like both Real Zaragoza, but also Valladolid or Albacete, who were iconic sides that played in the first division or had good stories to tell, now are being relegated to the background of the game, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, Real Zaragoza for me is a La Liga club, so it's quite shocking they've been away for so long. And I hope they turn it around. But yeah, that second division is difficult to get out of. I mean, there have been some sides that are coming down and going back up, but there's clubs like Gijón have been down there a little while now as well, and they've got good attendances and a nice stadium, but that hasn't really counted for anything. So yeah, it's difficult to get out of. Okay, well, we've touched on parts of the regions of Spain, but in the book it's a lot more detail. So I would urge listeners to go out and buy it. I've read it; it is a superb read. So Miguel, while you were writing the book, any highlights or stories of your travels around Spain?
Well, essentially, what I do recommend is do a lot of traveling, because Spain is a country that you can read about them, but it's more interesting if you live it in first person, of course, and you know that by experience. And for me, the best thing it was actually to travel around, just to meet the people there, to enjoy different experiences. Whenever the grounds I was visiting, it was always different from the other. Chat with the people, understand the local culture. It was a very rich experience to be, for instance, in Seville and be watching a match at the Villamarin before they get the stadium rebuilt over the next few years. Also, at the same time, to experience how Celta Vigo is coming in to become a side that will probably contend for European spots quite soon, because they have a sound project within the youth academy, and also has become sort of a banner of Galicia, since Deportivo has been playing the second tier for most part of the last decade. So they lost a lot of relevance there. At the same time, obviously, if you go to bigger cities like both Madrid or Barcelona, it's also good to understand there are different football clubs there, not just the big ones, just to watch Europa, which is a smaller side from Barcelona, or Unión Adarve or Rayo Vallecano, are not the big sides in Madrid, and understand that the city has a life of their own. If you just look outside of what you're expected to see in the Bernabeus, in the Metropolitanos, or in the Camp Nous. So essentially, for me, it's the idea was to take those stories out of a box, then they are usually hidden up, and bring them to the world. And those sorts of trips that I made around the country, and also the conversations that I have with a lot of people, allowed to make like a sort of photo album of different aspects of Spain, and put them out so people could get the chance to see them. Because in the end, one of the reasons behind writing this book was also that there is a lack of books about Spanish football in English, despite being such a rich nation, and despite having probably the most powerful league in continental Europe. You don't get to see much books about Spanish football. You get your books about Barcelona, Real Madrid, eventually some individuals like Guardiola, or some clubs that are more iconic than others like Rayo Vallecano. But in a sense, the idea of knowing Spanish football is still very alien to people outside of Spain, in the English speaking world, or in the Northern European speaking countries. So in a sense, this book is like an open door for them to get in and get to know more about Spain as a nation, and also Spain as a reflection of how football could be lived and could be felt as a supporter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Reading the book, that really comes through. Is how much you love the country and its rich tapestry, etc. And it could inspire some people to go on a trip to one of the clubs in the regions and watch some football, or even just to experience it, as a trip. Now, obviously, there's lots of regions around Spain, and beer is part of Spanish culture, a huge part of Spanish culture, and there's various different beers around the country, and there's always a debate here in Seville, and I'm sure it is in other cities, as to what the best Spanish beer is. It would appear, I think, there's kind of like a consensus from people I speak to that Estrella Galicia is probably the best. But then Cruz Campo is much maligned. But then I know people in Seville that will refuse to go in bars that sell Mau because they say it tastes bad. Right? So what I'll put you on the spot here. What's your favourite Spanish beer?
I would say Estrella Galicia. for a mile. I think it's probably the best. I've drank probably most Mao because I lived in Madrid for so long, and that's the common beer that you get there. But essentially, I think Estrella Galicia is the best. I taste all of them throughout the country, so it's very hard for me to just point one. But I think Estrella Galicia is probably the most crafted one.
Yeah, it is a nice one. I quite like Alhambra as well. Alhambra's good.
Yeah.
Particularly the green one, but that can be a bit dangerous because it's quite strong. Although what I will say for Cruz Campo is it does taste very nice at 44 degrees, which is maybe what it's designed for. But there you go. Okay, well, just finally then, just an interesting question to wrap up on. Now, in Spain, the biggest three clubs, obviously Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Atletico Madrid these days. I mean, they may well have always been the third biggest club in Spain, although Athletic Club in Bilbao had more titles in the past until recent years. Now, there's several clubs that could lay a claim to being the fourth biggest in Spain. So you've got Real Betis, Sevilla, Bilbao, Sociedad, Valencia. I'd probably struggle to think of any more, maybe Zaragoza. Well, who do you think's got a good claim to being the fourth biggest club in Spain, and why?
Yeah, if you think about rankings, then you have to put all the ingredients in there. You have to see titles won. You have to see the impact they had on the history of the game. You have, of course, to see the fan base, and you have to see how the club still is today, because you could have been a giant back in the day, but now if you're in a lowdown, it's hard to lay claim to such a crown. So I still think that Atletico Club Bilbao has the stronger claim for fourth place, because they really were the biggest side for 50 years in Spanish football. They left a profound imprint on the game and how the game was played by the national side for a lot of decades. They also have a very strong connection with their fan base, not only the ones that live in the Basque country, but all the Basques living outside. And I think when they won the Copa del Rey final a couple of seasons ago, it was a good example of how they were able to celebrate with almost 1 million people on the streets in Bilbao, which was absolutely bonkers. And obviously, as a club of tradition, a club that used football as well within the society, the foundation of the football club has done wonders within not only Bilbao, but all the Basque country. The Thinking Football Festival is important. The One Player Award is important as well. I think the idea of creating a football club that is more than a football club is really alive there. And probably if there was a football club that could claim the fourth place without being Athletic Club, would be Valencia. But of course, Valencia's been such in a hard situation over the past 15 years that lost some of that relevance. If those 15 years would have been kinder to them, I think they would probably already lay claim to that spot, because of course they play back-to-back Champions League finals. Athletic Bilbao only played 2 Europa League finals in their history. They have a good chance this season to finally get the trophy that they never won in Europe, so that will be also a plus for them. But Valencia won leagues over the years. They won European competitions as well. They played finals. They had great players. Now Mestalla is for me the best stadium in Spain by a mile. So I think it will be toe-to-toe between those two, with all respect, with Betis and Sevilla and even Zaragoza. And I think if Valencia would be in a better situation now, they would probably be the fourth side. But since Bilbao showed with winning the Copa del Rey that they are still much a winning force, they have a good sound project, they still have a great cantera, a great youth academy, like in players like Nico Williams have shown throughout the years, they are still able to produce those talents and to stay true to their conception of playing only Basque players in their side. So a mix of that makes them want me to choose them as number 4, but with Valencia very close by.
Yeah, it's incredible with Athletic Club that they've never been relegated with the Basque only policy, and the amount of trophies they've won in the past. I mean, if you just, people these days, because they haven't, well, until the Copa del Rey a couple of years ago, it's been so long since they won something, but you don't realise how many Copa del Reys they already had, on the honours board. I watched that final here on the Alameda in Seville, and I was with a group of friends. Some were Betis fans, but one of them was an Athletic fan who used to work for Betis, and his friends were there. So we watched it with Bilbao fans, when they won it, one of them just burst into tears. He was so emotional. We were having to give him a hug and pat him on the back and stuff. He just cried his eyes out, and he actually had a ticket for the stadium. He didn't go because he was too nervous. and he just kept saying, I can't believe we won something, because he never saw them. He was too young, you know, for the free, and he never thought they'd, because of the Basque only policy, and it's been a bit up and down over recent years with them. He never thought he'd see them win a trophy. So yeah, they're a great club, and I think a subject for another podcast. Okay, Miguel, it's been brilliant. I would thoroughly recommend reading this book. I've read it. It's out very soon. When's it out, and where can people pick up a copy?
Well, it's out April 21st, so you could get a copy if you're in Spain in Amazon.es, because the Spanish version of Amazon has the book. And if you're in the UK, basically, I always recommend your local bookstore, because it's also important to build up community, especially when you're writing about the importance of the community within the game. But if you're not, then you always can buy it at places like Waterstones or even Amazon, because they deliver almost everywhere. So the book will be available on those platforms as well.
Okay, great. Well, get yourself a copy. Okay, so that's it for this episode of the Football Culture Podcast. Miguel, where can people follow you on social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. Sorry, I cannot, for the fandom of it, call it X. I at Miguel_LP8. So you can find me there, and also the book. We're doing a lot of promo there. Also adding up, like we've been discussing, things related to those regions, like playlists of musics that are connected, recommended playlists to listen while you're reading, or at least to find out more about the local culture, because it's also one of the aspects that I wanted to talk in the book, how important the culture is in Spain, and how much people don't know the richness that the Spanish culture really has because of the language barrier. So in a sense, that also is a good pretext to read the book and find out, well, new movies to see, new bands to listen, new places to visit, and to enjoy the game as well.
Okay, brilliant. Well, if the listeners could recommend the podcast to friends, give us reviews on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us on all the social media. If you go to the description of the podcast, it has all the links there. And thank you very much, Miguel, for appearing, and very much look forward to seeing the book being published.
Thank you for having me, James, and I probably will be back here for another discussion in the future. I would say it will be fun.
I think that's something we'll definitely have to arrange. Thank you very much.